Please. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, there are two economies today in Nova Scotia. The economy that was portrayed in yesterday's budget, which takes the American bond rating agencies, Standard & Poor's and Moody's as its points of reference. And then there is another economy, the economy of the urgent situation of daily life, which takes as its points of reference the mortgage, the landlord, the groceries. The budget omits the key indicator from the real economy that our province has the lowest median income in the country. And yet the government trumpets in the budget an incremental and paltry minimum wage increase of 55 cents, as though they were accomplishing something epic. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier actually think that 55 cents an hour is going to lift us out of having the lowest median wage in the median income in the whole country?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for answering the question. Mr. Speaker, I've always had a great admiration for the Leader of the New Democratic Party, Mr. Speaker, and I want to commend him on showing great leadership today by being in question period. I want to respond to his question, Mr. Speaker. The issues that he raises here are serious ones impacting families. That's why we continue to raise the basic personal exemption for low-income Nova Scotians. It's why we continue to make sure rent supplements are in place to ensure low-income Nova Scotians have access, Mr. Speaker, to affordable housing. The investments in the budget that will look at our own housing stock across the province and then working with those in the private sector who provide affordable income rentals are a positive thing. We know we're more towards the middle of the pack when it comes to average income in the province, Mr. Speaker, across the country. But that doesn't help those who require those support on low income. That's why, if the honourable member looks back, all of our investments have been targeted towards those citizens who require our help the most.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, for the Premier to compare the personal tax exemption change with what would happen with a $15 minimum wage is like comparing a pea with a giant pumpkin. It's a $13 a month increase on the tax exemption, $640 a month for people making $11 to get up to $15. But here's another key indicator from the real economy. Nova Scotia has the fastest rising rate of food bank use in the whole country. This is an open wound for us. And it's not something that calls just for a little Band-Aid. And yet, yesterday in the budget, we've got the Band-Aid of a just $11 a month increase in social assistance rates for single people on the caseload. Now, there's no economist in Nova Scotia who's going to think or say that an $11 increase a month is going to change the number of people that we've got who can actually get their food out of a store instead of having to get it charitably from a food bank. So I want to ask the Premier, does he really think that an income assistance increase of $11 a month is going to lift us out of the state of being the food bank capital of Canada?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you can't look at one particular announcement, Mr. Speaker, as part of that budget. He would also know the increase in rent supplements, Mr. Speaker, for low-income Nova Scotians to allow them to live in affordable housing. He would also know the amount of investments that we're making in housing across the province. That is a real cost for low-income Nova Scotians, and how do we support them to leave more money with their families. He also recognized that there is an increase in a minimum wage in this province. We continue to make sure that we have that increase. We're following the formula that was set out by the New Democratic Party, except this, Mr. Speaker, in this budget, we actually went beyond that, Mr. Speaker, and increased it larger than what was actually recommended. That is a positive thing. We know there is still more work to do. He also would know in this budget that this coming year will be when we put the standard household rate in, which, Mr. Speaker, will have the largest impact on Nova Scotia families on income assistance on any decision that any government has made in this province.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Here is the third indicator from the real economy, Mr. Speaker. This indicator was also omitted from the budget, that there's only one province in our country where child poverty is getting worse instead of getting better, and that's Nova Scotia. Now, this is something that ought not to be omitted in any economic consideration. The fact that in our little province, we have 27,000 children who are living below the line. Mr. Speaker, does the Premier understand how disappointing it is that he has brought forward a budget which is more worried about Standard & Poor's, more worried about Moody's, than it is about feeding the children of our province?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I don't agree, Mr. Speaker, with the premise of his question. I do believe, Mr. Speaker, it's important that we can be able to afford the things that our families and citizens across this province require, Mr. Speaker. It's why we've invested $5 million in poverty reduction. It's why we continue to make sure that child support payments are not put into the system calculated when it comes to those who require our supports, Mr. Speaker. Those are all real investments made back into families across our province. I also want to tell the honourable member the most important thing that we can continue to do in this province to continue to grow an economy that provides employment opportunities for our citizens, Mr. Speaker. We are at an all-time low, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to unemployment levels. That is a positive sign. I do agree with the honourable member on one thing. There is still more work to do, Mr. Speaker, but every trend in this province is headed in the right direction. And to go back to, Mr. Speaker, and to go back to the question when he talked about child poverty, I too was alarmed when I saw those numbers, Mr. Speaker, because when you dig into the conversation, seniors on low income are find that numbers continuing to reduce. Single-parent families, which have children in them, Mr. Speaker, that number has continued to reduce. So the numbers don't add up. We're looking to see where they brought those stats and what has made the difference. But we are concerned. That's why when you look inside of this budget, those investments are targeted directly towards those citizens who require help the most.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. The Human Rights Commission Street Checks report released today overwhelmingly confirmed that street checks are an instance of systemic racism. They damage and disrupt the lives of African Nova Scotians and other racialized people. African Nova Scotians have been saying this for decades. The report is clear. Whether it is ultimately banned or regulated, there should be an immediate moratorium now. As the Decade for the People of African Descent Committee says, street checks are illegal, and we do not regulate illegal activities. Mr. Speaker, street checks need to stop now. Will the minister tell this House that there will be a ban on street checks before this sitting is over?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my colleague for the question. She joined us this morning for the release of Dr. Wortley's report. I want to acknowledge the content of that report. We've just received it. It'll take some time to go through it. But we do recognize, Mr. Speaker, that what's contained in the report is troubling. The outcomes that we're seeing are simply unacceptable, and this government will take appropriate steps with prudent analysis of the report and its findings before making any determination.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, our province has been talking about the racist impact of street checks since at least 2003. This report today was 16 years overdue. Ending street checks is at least 16 years overdue. To echo one community participant, it shouldn't take a white man from Toronto to convince government to hear what African Nova Scotians have been saying for decades. 20-year-old Trayvon Clayton spoke this morning about being thrown to the ground with a knee in his back as a 16-year-old leaving a party in a white neighborhood. He asked the minister for action today. The DPAD committee asked the minister for action today. This information has been available for years. The situation has been known for decades. Will the minister follow the recommendation of Dr. Wortley's report and of the African Nova Scotian community, and at the very least put an immediate moratorium on street checks while he determines what to do next?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to be clear. Dr. Wortley did not phrase the findings of his report in the form of a recommendation. He presented two options, Mr. Speaker, with
order, please. The Honourable Minister of Justice has the floor.
He presented two options, Mr. Speaker, with multiple elements to each of those options, and he has left those decisions to government and stakeholders to make. We will, Mr. Speaker, engage those stakeholders. I committed today to engage the communities, to have a broader discussion, because, Mr. Speaker, this review was restricted to only HRM, and none of us are naive to think that these circumstances don't exist in the rest of the province, Mr. Speaker. I also committed, Mr. Speaker, to directing police to cease the process of using street checks as a performance measure element, and I will give direction to police to cease the use of street checks as quota items, Mr. Speaker. These behaviours are simply unacceptable, and this government will take action to correct that.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. According to the ESIA policy manual, any ESIA applicant who may qualify for Canada Pension Plan benefits must apply for those benefits. If eligible, those benefits are then charged at 100% against their monthly ESIA entitlement, and I can table that. CPP is a contributory benefit that Nova Scotians pay into over their working lives. Mr. Speaker, does the minister think it is appropriate that this government is clawing back 100% of the CPP benefits of vulnerable seniors?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We have been engaged in a process of improving our ESIA system, Mr. Speaker, and throughout this process we have looked at a number of different benefits that come to our clients from other jurisdictions. For example, the Canada Child Benefit is not clawed back, etc., etc. So I do want to thank the honourable member for the question, but I do have to say that yes, we do require that folks who are able to get income from other sources actually do get that income from other sources. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, based on experiences with constituents in my office and in the offices of my colleagues, we've learned that the policy of this government to require older individuals to apply early for reduced CPP benefits in order to access ESIA. Mr. Speaker, CPP is reduced by 7% for each year you receive it before age 65. This means that an individual who starts receiving their CPP retirement pension at the age of 60 will receive 36% less than if they had taken it at 65. This has a very negative long-term impact on the economic security of seniors. At a recent event in Dartmouth, the Federal Minister for Seniors said that they are advising seniors to delay applying for CPP to age 70, if at all possible. Mr. Speaker, will the minister acknowledge that this misguided policy of her government is harmful to the economic security of vulnerable seniors?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I do think she is under somewhat of a misapprehension. She refers to this as a policy of my government. In fact, it was the policy of their government as well. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the changes announced to the Cape Breton Regional Hospital on Monday include opening 12 additional critical care beds to bring the complement at the regional to 36, up from 24. While the new beds at the regional is a good thing, under this government's plan, our communities will lose 66 inpatient beds between New Waterford and Northside hospitals in exchange for the new ones at the regional. Mr. Speaker, does the minister really think that a net loss of 54 beds in Cape Breton is what we need right now?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. I appreciate the member acknowledging the important, significant investment that was announced on Monday at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital to modernize healthcare infrastructure at that site, doubling the emergency department, doubling the cancer centre, new cancer centre, and almost tripling the size of the critical care services there. And Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the member that we've only announced one portion of the entire Cape Breton Regional hospital redevelopment project on Monday. So she's, I think, jumping to conclusions as to the net impact of this redevelopment project. The budget speech yesterday, Mr. Speaker, there's an indication of an increase, even above the increase we had previously announced for long-term care beds in both New Waterford and North Sydney.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, I wasn't referring to long-term care beds and the proposed increase. What I'm referring to is that the minister's announcement that there would be no inpatient beds in New Waterford or North Sydney, and that was discussed at the announcement when it was first made. Mr. Speaker, the inpatient beds in Waterford and Northside hospitals are currently in use. They do things like allow people to recover from orthosurgeries or provide a place for elderly residents to recover from pneumonia close to their loved ones. These beds serve a purpose, and in a time when our healthcare system is in crisis, Cape Bretoners cannot fathom why this government would want to cut our services in those hospitals rather than expand them. While the expansion of the regional is a good thing, the minister is forcing us to give up the services we already have in exchange for that expansion. This is a false choice. There's no reason we shouldn't have both, and why can't we? Mr. Speaker, does the minister think Cape Bretoners deserve to have a functioning regional hospital and community hospitals?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member again for bringing the topic of the Cape Breton Region Hospital Redevelopment Plan to the floor of the Legislature, Mr. Speaker. This is a plan that this government, that I am very proud of, Mr. Speaker. It's a plan that we've listened to healthcare providers and people on the ground, Mr. Speaker. We have physicians that are providing input to the planning team to help guide and influence the specific details that are being rolled out, Mr. Speaker. And I'm proud that as a government, we've been able to manage our finances so that we have the money to invest in these types of initiatives, Mr. Speaker, to provide the health care that Cape Bretoners, as was indicated on Monday, physicians on the front line have been advocating for over a decade. And we are the government that are making the investments to make it happen for the people of Cape Breton.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Lands and Forestry. 2 years ago, the Auditor General found that this government was failing at-risk wildlife in Nova Scotia and had no recovery plans for many species. Yesterday, the Auditor General reported that after 2 years, the department has not completed a single one of the 2016 recommendations. We are talking about species like the mainland moose, black ash trees, wood turtles, and the Canada warbler. These are important parts of our biodiversity in Nova Scotia. Will the minister tell this House when all 5 of the Auditor General's recommendations on species at risk will be completed?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for the question. Of course, we agree with the Auditor General's recommendations. The department has implemented 3/4 of the recommendations around forest management and protection. This year in our business plan, the member would note that there is an increased focus on looking at species at risk and wildlife, and we continue to prioritize biodiversity. A lot of the recommendations are interconnected with the independent Leahy report on forestry practices, which we are in the progress of implementing, and we look forward to bringing forth the recovery plans and renewing those recovery teams that she's referenced for those number of species and working with the experts in the field, and we'll have more to say in the coming weeks. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, the minister talks a good game about biodiversity, and yet we can see in the follow-up report of the Auditor General that the actions have not been there to back up the words. In 2015, the East Coast Environmental Law Association found that the province was not complying with the Endangered Species Act. In 2016, the Auditor General confirmed it. This year, a group of citizens are taking the province to court because of its failures to comply with the Act. Given these facts, I think it's reasonable for the public to question the minister's commitment to biodiversity. Can he explain his department's inaction on protecting wildlife and species at risk as per the Auditor General's findings?
The Honourable Minister of Lands and Forestry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, I thank the member for the question. It's an important topic for Nova Scotians. The Biodiversity Act that we're bringing forward is part of our response to the Leahy report, and it's an important piece of legislation that will actually help us close the gaps in current legislation that will help us prevent species from even entering into the category of threatened or species at risk. So it allows us to have more tools. A commitment is seen in this budget with $1.7 million allocated so that we can allow to have more money for resources. There's actually 2 more FTEs being added to the department for biologists so they can work on species at risk, and 60% of species Actually, 60% of species do have recovery plans, and the ones that don't, of the 40%, the majority of them are led by the federal government. But I'm not resting on our laurels. The government believes that we can do more, and we will do more, as I said, in this year. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Today, the report on street checks by Dr. Wortley overwhelmingly confirmed what African Nova Scotians have been saying for decades, that street checks are an instance of systemic racism and they damage and disrupt the lives of African Nova Scotians and other racialized people. The report makes clear that there should be an immediate moratorium on street checks. That is something African Nova Scotians have called for from the beginning of this conversation. We called for that in this House, but the Liberals have refused to support a moratorium. Will the minister now admit that we should have had a moratorium from the beginning, and will he apologize for his government's foot dragging?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. As she has indicated, the work done by Dr. Wortley clearly demonstrates that African Nova Scotians are disproportionately represented in police stops and street checks. This is simply alarming. It's unacceptable. I committed today publicly, Mr. Speaker, to take steps in providing directions to the law enforcement community across our province, not only here in HRM. I've committed, Mr. Speaker, to meeting with the coalition, representatives from the Human Rights Commission, representatives from the Halifax Police Commission, the law enforcement community, government, including Department of Justice and African Nova Scotian Affairs. We will get to the bottom of this, Mr. Speaker. We will find a solution. We will correct this wrong.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, we're at the bottom of it. We've known what this is for decades, for centuries. It's systemic racism, and it needs to be addressed today. Mr. Speaker, as one community participant said, it shouldn't take a white man from Toronto to convince government to hear what African Nova Scotians have been saying for decades. But before today, the minister wouldn't even say that African Nova Scotians being 5 times more likely to be stopped than a white person is systemic racism. Dr. Wortley's study shows that numbers aren't due to crime or place, they are due to race. We can stop street checks now, and the minister has that power. There is no need to wait months. Will the minister acknowledge that street checks are racist and tell us why he won't stop them immediately?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I clearly indicated today that street checks in the manner they're being performed is simply unacceptable, Mr. Speaker. African Nova Scotian males are stopped 6 times more than a Caucasian male, Mr. Speaker. That is unacceptable. We recognize that. We accept that. I've accepted the report of Dr. Wortley. We will look at the options that Dr. Wortley has advanced, Mr. Speaker, and we will respond in support of the community and ensure that these practices cease going forward.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, the Community Homes Action Group have repeatedly given the government a failing grade on their progress on the roadmap for transforming the Nova Scotia Services to Persons with Disabilities program. They have recommended an investment in at least 25 new small option homes each year for the next 3 years. The budget tabled yesterday applauded the same 8 community options homes the government had announced in the 2018 budget. Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain why the government has failed to make meaningful progress on access to housing as called for in the roadmap?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We want all Nova Scotians to be able to live in their communities and to participate in their communities, Mr. Speaker. And that's why in the 2017 election, we promised to build 8 new small options homes. As I've previously indicated to the member, 2 of the homes are up and running right now. Another 2 are rolling out fairly soon. The other ones went out to RFP and they are in the planning stages. I want her to understand that it is not simply about money. It is also about being able to put people in a situation where they will succeed. We have to make sure that when someone moves out into community, into a small option home, that they have the supports available, Mr. Speaker, and that they're also in a situation where they can thrive. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, an independent board of inquiry ruled that the province has violated the human rights of Beth McLean, Sheila Livingston, and Joey Delaney by not providing access to housing options. In a letter to the Premier, Barb Horner, on behalf of the Disability Rights Coalition, said the province had a decision to make, that they could allow the 1,500 persons with disabilities in this province lacking necessary supports to languish, while hundreds will seek to file their own human rights complaint, or it can do the right thing. Mr. Speaker, will the minister admit that with this budget, the government has failed to do the right thing?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. First of all, she should be aware that, in fact, of those 1,500 people that she refers to, the vast majority are already receiving some form of service from the Department of Community Services, often not always in institutions. In fact, about only 500 of them are institutions, which is still too many, I agree. But she needs to know that, in fact, the vast majority of those people are receiving some services from the Department of Community Services, often to live at home, Mr. Speaker. We are committed to helping people move out into community, and we are doing so making sure that this can be done safely and successfully. We have to make sure, for example, if there's someone who vocalizes all day long, you're not going to put them in with someone who's very sensitive to noise. We have to make sure, Mr. Speaker, that people move out into community in appropriate ways so that they can feel safe and be successful. Thank you.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, I received a letter from the Minister in November of 2018. In it, he committed to meet with the Nova Scotians for equalization fairness in 2019. At the end of February of this year, I received an email from the group saying that the meeting still has not happened. And as an FYI, there is a meeting being held on April the 7th that he is more than welcome to attend. My question for the Minister is, why has he failed to keep his promise to meet with the Nova Scotians for Equalization and Fairness Group?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Promised back some time ago, we will be making our way to Cape Breton to meet with a variety of different municipal units along the way. We will also take the opportunity to invite that organization and others that might like to chat with us while we're down there, an opportunity as we had promised, and we'll do that in the coming months, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that answer, and I would like to be included in those meetings, as well as I would say again that April 7th they're holding a public or a closed meeting for politicians only. Mr. Speaker, when the Minister first entered his new role, he was failing to answer emails and phone calls from the Nova Scotians for Equalization and Fairness. I asked him at the time if unanswered phone calls was the treatment Cape Bretoners could expect from the new Minister. I'm sad to say the pattern has continued. The urgent challenges CBRM faces with its tax base, debt load, and funding for services can't be ignored by this province, and the CBRM needs to be a priority in his new role. When can Cape Bretoners, Mr. Speaker, expect the major economic stimulus it needs from this province?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I had stated in my first answer, we'll be going down to Cape Breton in the coming months once the House rises. We'll get that arranged. We'll certainly be happy to meet with that organization and others. We're going to stop and visit some municipal units along the way. It's common practice, and I haven't been out that way yet, but we will get there. As far as investments, Mr. Speaker, we made one great investment on Monday when the Minister of Health was down there. They made an announcement in the CBRM. Mr. Speaker, we could talk about a number of projects. The Second Birth, $3.2 million for the New Dawn project, Mr. Speaker, and I could go on. There are many investments that have been made in the past while by this government, Mr. Speaker. We will continue, as the Minister of Health spoke to a few minutes ago, Mr. Speaker, to invest in Cape Breton. Thank you.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Health. Last fall, the Minister of Health admitted that my community needs and deserves a sexual assault nurse examiner after stories of rape victims being turned away from the hospital in Truro with nothing more than some pamphlets. After asking for months now about this, I'm pleased to see that funding for a sane position is included in this year's budget. However, can the Minister please tell us when the good women of Cumberland Colchester can expect a sane to be in place?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased that the member is happy with the announcement that the Minister of Finance, the member from Colchester North, who also raised concerns about the access to sane services in the Colchester-Truro region, Mr. Speaker. That's why, as I'd indicated in the fall, as the Premier indicated, we believe that expanding the services was appropriate. As I've mentioned before in the House, we looked to find a quick ability to expand the services immediately over the fall. Those efforts fell through, but while we were doing that, we also looked to say, where else are there gaps? We saw Cumberland as well. That's why we brought it into the budget process to develop a comprehensive RFP, Mr. Speaker, to ensure we're providing services not just for Colchester, but for Cumberland County as well.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to note that, yes, it took a couple of women to get the job done. Could the minister please tell me and assure me today that he would personally get in touch with the Colchester Sexual Assault Centre to apologize for the long delay in addressing this issue, since they have written numerous times and received nothing back from his department? And if he could please give them a specific timeline so the rest of us will be in the know. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as my wife would know, I have no problem taking direction and advice from women, Mr. Speaker. They often set me on the right path. Sorry, but Mr. Speaker, in seriousness, in response, I apologize, and I'll Mr. Speaker, right here in the House, if I have unresponded correspondence with the group, I'll certainly go back to the office and double check. I do get a very large amount of correspondence that comes through my office, Mr. Speaker. I really do try to get through all of it in as most timely matter as possible. Sometimes pieces of correspondence do get misplaced or misconstrued. So again, I'll certainly go through, see if we can find that and get back to them. But again, I apologize if I've been delayed to that.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Cape Breton Regional Hospital Emergency Department had 24 admitted patients in it. The department only has 24 beds. As the minister should know, admitted patients are meant to be in inpatient beds, not in our emergency rooms. When admitted patients are in emergency room beds, they clog the system, preventing people presenting at triage from actually making it into the emergency room. Mr. Speaker, will the minister acknowledge that the additional beds he announced for Cape Breton yesterday or this week are not helping with the problems we are facing today and every day like it?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member we've had conversations would know, the fact of the matter is some of the structural challenges that are in place in our healthcare system, as I've certainly heard from healthcare professionals across this province, many of those structural challenges have been building for decades, Mr. Speaker, and a failure to act on them. The steps that we're taking is based upon advice and suggestions that are coming from the front line to ensure that we build a sustainable healthcare system, providing the care that's needed by the people of Cape Breton and throughout the province. We know that's the long-term path to the success. But, Mr. Speaker, we also recognize we have to take steps in the short term as well. That's why, as part of our Cape Breton redevelopment healthcare project, we also included a community paramedicine program, Mr. Speaker, a program that's designed to help with the discharge of patients safely out of the hospital more efficiently so that we can free up those beds to continue the positive and improvement in patient flow.
The honourable member for Cape Breton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, the overcrowding at the Cape Breton Regional Emergency Department is directly connected to the shortage of long-term care beds in our province. People are living in hospitals when they should be in nursing homes, which leads to people who should be in inpatient beds staying in the emergency room, while those who are seeking care have nowhere to go but the waiting room. We need nursing home beds open and receiving people to get our hospitals working again. We needed them 5 years ago. But instead of investing in the care our people need, this government has spent 5 years neglecting our community, landing us in the mess that we're in today with not one new long-term care bed opened. This budget was an opportunity to make real investments in long-term care, but they've blown it. Mr. Speaker, is the minister so proud of his plan to open new nursing home beds in Cape Breton? If he is, will he please tell us why there's no dedicated funds in this budget for the construction, or will that be next year's election promise?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite. As the member would know, these complex infrastructure investments, which in the community in the Cape Breton region itself, Mr. Speaker, to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars. The announcement that we made on Monday in Cape Breton itself, in the Sydney area, Mr. Speaker, is over $100 million to expand the Cape Breton Regional Hospital, providing infrastructure that's going to provide the tools and the technology and the space to provide modern healthcare services to the community. Services that have been advocated for by frontline healthcare workers for decades, Mr. Speaker, and this is the government that's recognized and taking action, just like we're taking action, Mr. Speaker, on putting long-term care beds expanded in those communities as well.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the minister responsible for the status of women. I saw a headline recently that said, as rental prices rise, women stay in bad relationships to survive. The article quoted studies from other countries, but we know that this is true in Nova Scotia as much as anywhere else. High rental rates can contribute to people staying in domestically violent situations. Will the minister support a rent control policy and major investments in new affordable housing?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question, and I don't think she was there, but I was actually in her riding last summer, where we announced money for 500 new rent supplements each year for 3 years. And although that was in the summertime, Mr. Speaker, I do want to let the House know that we actually exceeded the 500 rent supplements that was our goal for this current fiscal. Last time I checked, which was a couple of weeks ago, we were actually at 543 rent supplements, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue rolling those out over the next couple of years as well.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, I deal in my constituency office with people applying for public housing, getting on the wait list, and that is the system through which people can sometimes access rent supplements. However, there are many people out there in the community living in buildings where they want to live and they want to stay, and they're seeing year after year rent increases. And that's not fair, and it's not sustainable for them in their personal lives when many of them are living on fixed incomes. So I'd like to ask the minister again, what stops this government from supporting rent control?
The Honourable Minister responsible for the status of women.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question, and I did want to clarify for her as well that for anyone escaping domestic violence, they can be bumped up on the rent supplement list and on the housing wait list. So I did want to share that with her. And I do want to let her know that we take this matter seriously. That is why we put that in place, Mr. Speaker. That is why we have directed funding to 2 transition houses, Mr. Speaker, so that women can leave domestic violence and live in good places with their children and start their lives over again. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, while members of the NSHA leadership team have been in the news lately insisting that there are no staffing shortages with our healthcare system, I have to respectfully and publicly disagree. According to healthcare workers on site, there are 2 ICU beds at the Halifax Infirmary that have been closed for 3 weeks straight because of staffing shortages. Nurses are working over capacity every day, and it's burning them out. Nurses are having vacations cancelled. Nurses are unable to have food breaks or bathroom breaks, Mr. Speaker, and that is unacceptable. So I have a simple question for the Minister of Health. Does the minister believe that there is a nursing crisis, a nursing shortage? Does he believe the NSHA or the nurses?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I've seen the same reports that the member seems to be referring to from the NSHA, I believe the comments that they have been making is an acknowledgement that, in fact, as a workforce as a whole throughout the province, there are 1,000 to 2,000 additional nurses working in the province today than there were 10 years ago. But they simultaneously, Mr. Speaker, recognize that there are certain areas within the province in which there are vacancies that are harder to fill. And Mr. Speaker, so that work is ongoing. As a province, we work to support and recognize the very important and valuable role that nurses in all of the healthcare system, hospitals, right through to community, primary practices, Mr. Speaker, that they provide for our healthcare system.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I guess that's a no to believing the nurses that they're working over capacity and short-staffed mostly all of the time. Mr. Speaker, many full-time nurses are reporting to us that they are dropping down to part-time status because of the dangerous workload and staffing levels that they have to deal with. We know these conditions have serious consequences for the patients. When there aren't enough nurses working, nurses may get the patient's medication wrong. They may fall trying to get out of bed without help. They may not get to the bathroom, which is the case in many instances. Mr. Speaker, can the minister tell us if this budget contains significant money for hiring new nurses into our system, or is the minister satisfied with the status quo?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite. I think the member would appreciate the work and the investments that we make as a government. I believe in 2019 we're expected to see almost 24% additional RN nursing graduates in the province of Nova Scotia. And Mr. Speaker, I believe we've added, Mr. Speaker, we've invested to add 25 additional nurse practitioner seats for registered nurses who want to upgrade their skills to become a nurse practitioner, to provide a broader scope of practice throughout the healthcare system. We're Mr. Speaker, investing to provide job opportunities for those nurses in collaborative care practices that we're expanding across the province. And we've invested an extra $10 million, Mr. Speaker, on top of the $17 million we'd already put in our budget, Mr. Speaker, for expanding collaborative care practices, of which nurses will be part of those teams.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Environment. There are still almost 100 wilderness areas in Nova Scotia that have been ready for protection since 2013, waiting for the signatures of the Ordering Council. The Premier has said he is committed to protecting them, but 6 years into the mandate of this government, it has only protected a handful. We're hardly any closer to reaching our 13% target. And these are areas that have been picked because they are important to Nova Scotia and Nova Scotians, and this government is ignoring them. I'd like to ask the minister, what is delaying the final protections of these important wilderness areas?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the honourable member for that very important question. You know, this is certainly something that our government has committed to, reaching a 13% protected area, and we plan to continue with that. Certainly in the early days when properties were starting to be protected and areas were starting to be protected because of biodiversity, there are many things to consider, including mineral rights. There were surveys that had to be done, different work. We had to make sure that there was no encumbrances on any of these properties, that they could be moved forward. In the early days, it was easy to do that, but now we're getting to that final stage. We're at 12.4% presently, which is quite remarkable in itself, but we know that there is still work to do on those final properties to make the move forward. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, in 2018, this government protected just 0.57% of our landmass. That is barely moving towards our goal. These areas were thoroughly surveyed and a plan was developed and consulted on when the NDP was in government. There is no reason for further delay. Protecting wilderness areas is key to supporting wildlife and sequestering carbon, and a government that actually cared about biodiversity would have finished the job by now. So after 6 years of foot dragging, can the minister tell this House on what date the rest of these important wilderness areas will be protected?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again for that question. Certainly, when we think about the protected areas in Nova Scotia and where we're going with that, it's very commendable, and I think we're on the right path to that. Right now, Mr. Speaker, we do have properties, as the honourable member pointed out, that are still sitting in the queue waiting to be addressed. But those go far beyond the 13%, Mr. Speaker. We have committed to 13%. So before we proceed any farther, we need to know that the best properties, the best that have the ecological features that most need to be protected are going to be protected. Thank you.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. As Nova Scotians are well aware, there is a serious issue unfolding in Ottawa focused on the independence of the Public Prosecution Service. The Ottawa Liberals seem to have a problem respecting the principle that there should be no interference in criminal prosecutions by elected officials. Here in Nova Scotia, following the advice of the 1989 Royal Commission on the Prosecution of Donald Marshall Jr., we adopted legislation establishing an independent public prosecution service. It's worked reasonably well, but the current crisis in Ottawa has focused our attention on prosecutions of corporations and the possible use of DPAs or deferred prosecution agreements. I want to ask the Minister whether, in light of the existence of deferred prosecution agreements and in light of the difficulties his political cousins in Ottawa are having in implementing them, if he is intending to amend governing legislation here to specifically address DPAs.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. It gives me an opportunity to recognize the outstanding service that our public prosecution provides in the province of Nova Scotia. They function totally independent of government, and I have no intentions at this time of addressing any legislation. Their service is, quite frankly, exemplary.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for that answer, although I would suggest that we always need to re-examine governing legislation. We've taken the opportunity to examine the Crown Attorney's Manual, which is a public document and an admirable set of guidelines, but it's obvious that it's written in terms that contemplate the prosecutions of individuals, not of corporations. In light of the Ottawa SNC-Lavalin mess, considering the increased frequency with which corporations may find themselves the focus of criminal investigations and prosecutions, even right here in Nova Scotia, will the minister undertake to revise the Crown Attorney's Manual to include a section that specifically addresses corporate prosecutions?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. She raises a valid point. I think I know in the portfolios I've had, I've advanced many pieces of legislation and multiple other efforts within each and every department to really look at updating legislation. Mr. Speaker, in these circumstances it would be no different, but there are no compelling circumstances at this time that necessitates that work.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Environment. There's been much talk of gold mines in the Tatamagouche watershed region, and even the Minister of Finance has signed a petition stating that she and other residents have great concerns and do not want to see this happening in their area. This January, we learned that the province left a gold exploration hole on Warwick Mountain, which has been spewing high arsenic water for the past couple of years. The province knew about the arsenic last year, but only decided to do something to stop it after media attention. So can the minister explain why her department thought it was okay to allow high arsenic water to continue spilling out of an old mining hole and did not act sooner?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment. Pardon me, the Honourable Minister of Mines and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for the question. Once we became aware of the situation with the hole, we reached out to the resident and we had it taken care of.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I recognize that that minister is new to that new department. This was an issue that the Department of Environment should have picked up on a long time ago and didn't do anything about until there was media attention. So, Mr. Speaker, again and again, this government fails to earn the public's trust when it comes to protecting clean air, water, and wilderness, from clear cuts to northern pulp and weak aquaculture regulations. Many residents in Nova Scotia are concerned about expanding gold mining impacting watersheds, especially in the Tatamagouche French River watershed region. And this affects many rivers, including going down to the Truro area. Can the minister explain how she expects residents to trust gold operations when the province can't even stop a known arsenic leak?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
I know it's a little confusing, Mr. Speaker. Anyway, thank you very much, and thank the honourable member for that question. Certainly, any time that any actions like this are taken in the province with any gold mine or any other industrial application, applications have to be made for environmental assessment. That includes hydrology reports and how it affects the surrounding communities. Communities always have an opportunity for input for those solutions, and in the end, we find the best solution that works and protects the environment of Nova Scotia. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much.